How do you take your game of D&D or D&D-like game like Dark or Pathfinder or any of the OSR games and make them grimdark? That's what I'm going to be discussing today. First, I want to lay some groundwork, talk a little bit about some different terms because they're often used kind of casually. First off, let's discuss high fantasy. High fantasy comes from literature, and it used to, back in the day, refer to fantasy that took place in a secondary world, i.e., not the real world. This was opposed to other fantasy that did take place in the real world or which had real-world characters go into a fantasy world. This definition hasn't been used for a long time. What high fantasy later became was kind of defined by Lord of the Rings and its many, many knockoffs, which became very popular in the 70s and 80s. Stuff like Raymond Feist's Rift War series, the Belgariad by David Eddings, Terry Brooks and his Shannara stuff, Weiss and Hickman and their Dragonlance stuff. That was all high fantasy. Many gamers will tell you that high fantasy is not the original mode of D&D. However, it is clearly the mode that most people are most familiar with. High fantasy has had another semantic shift more recently, though, especially among gamers, where it kind of just refers to the quantity of highly fantastic things in the game or setting or work. So if it has more fantastic stuff, it's high fantasy. This is opposed to low fantasy, which used to refer to, again, fantasy that takes place in the real world or featuring characters from the real world. It later kind of became almost synonymous with sword and sorcery, which is most famously encapsulated by the Conan the Barbarian stuff and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser by Robert E. Howard and Fritz Leiber, respectively. There's obviously other works that fit the genre as well, or the subgenre, but many people will tell you that Dungeons & Dragons is based on sword and sorcery rather than high fantasy. I don't believe this is actually true. There's very little in D&D as it's usually played that actually resembles sword and sorcery, and this is less true. It has become much less true over time. In fact, I heard somebody say, and it was kind of flippant, but it's also kind of true, there is, for example, more dungeon crawling in the first 10 minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark than there is in the entire sword and sorcery subgenre of work from fiction. Low fantasy, of course, has had the same semantic shift that high fantasy has, and that means the opposite. So low fantasy is now fantasy that is relatively low in fantastic elements. It doesn't have lots of weird races and cat people and whimsical magic all over the place, and it's much more grounded and quote-unquote realistic. I think that in reality, high fantasy and low fantasy are much more about tone and mood nowadays than they are about anything else. So if you're going to kind of grimdark up your setting, what you want to do is take a D&D-like game and move it down the scale from high fantasy into more low fantasy by giving it kind of a different mood, kind of a different tone. Grimdark, of course, is kind of an endpoint on a spectrum. I personally don't want to go quite that far, but I do like fantasy that is kind of grounded, that is more realistic, that is more humanocentric, and which feels more like it has elements of horror mingled with it rather than elements of the Avengers, which is what D&D feels like nowadays more than anything else. It's fantasy superheroes. Sword and sorcery is also superheroes, but they're more grounded superheroes. Sometimes people will tell you that sword and sorcery is not about superheroes. This is frankly kind of ridiculous. Conan the Barbarian is clearly a superhero, or at least he's so superlative compared to everybody else in the setting that he appears in that he might as well be. The same is basically true for Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. The same is basically true for Elric, even though and I won't get into this, that's actually kind of a subversive anti-sword and sorcery rather than true sword and sorcery. But the point is that the heroes, if you will, the protagonists, the player characters, if you will, of sword and sorcery are in fact quite heroic, not just in terms of their attitude and their the things that they do, where in fact they aren't necessarily heroic, but rather in the sense that they're more powerful and more over the top compared to pretty much everybody around them. Anybody who thinks that Conan is not a superhero has never read very much of Robert E. Howard, in my opinion. However, there's definitely a different tone. If D&D 5th edition and 4th edition and even 3rd edition to some degree is the Avengers, then low fantasy, the kind of stuff that I am talking about, the kind of stuff that moves down the spectrum towards grimdark, is at best going to be the Christian Bale Batman movies or the Chris Cox Daredevil TV show. Yeah, the characters are kind of superlative. They're pretty good, but it's a much more grounded setting. It's a much more grounded type of action. There's a lot less flashiness. And frankly, the characters that have to be worried that they are in over their heads pretty much all the time. So like I said, I kind of like to bring many elements of the mood and tone of horror into my fantasy games. Grimdark is maybe a step even further from that, where stuff's just nihilistic and crappy for its own sake. And I think, again, that doesn't appeal to me. Frankly, I don't think it appeals to a lot of people. I don't think it has a lot of appeal. But kind of going closer to grimdark without going all the way there is kind of what I'm talking about. Because, who doesn't love a good horror story? Who doesn't love Frankenstein? Who doesn't love Dracula? Who doesn't love, the American Werewolf in London or whatever other, classic horror story there is? I love a good ghost story set in the real world. Why wouldn't I also love one set in a fantasy setting? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you do that, and I'm going to be kind of system agnostic, but I am going to be referring to things in a very D&D-like system. So it could be true for 5th edition, it could be true for 3rd edition, it could be true for 1st edition or Basic Expert or any retro clones of those older games, or Pathfinder or Tales of the Valiant, or whatever other D&D-like game you may be playing that has kind of classic fantasy archetypes, possibly even over-the-top heroic fantasy archetypes, or not heroic, but superhero-like fantasy archetypes and crazy weirdness like 5th edition does, where you have, I don't know, turtle people and cat people and bird people, and they're supposed to be just as common and normal as people, and literally every class has all kinds of mystical powers and spellcasting abilities and all kinds of other weird stuff like that. Of course, much of that is going to have to change to give us that low fantasy headed towards grimdark tone. And I'm going to talk about this as kind of like a template, things that you can add that will make things more grimdark. The first thing to do in order to get this tone is right at the very beginning. And every rule book I've ever seen over the last many, many years basically starts with character generation. And this is where there needs to be some changes right away. Every game of D&D or D&D-like game that I've seen, with the exception of the retro clones and their spin-offs, that has come out since 3rd edition at least, so about 2000, has had very powerful characters who grow very quickly in power. And even in the older games, they grew fairly quickly in power, assuming they survived those first few levels. So right off the bat, one of the things that older games had that newer games don't is lower power in terms of bonuses and stats. Now, the mathematics has been adjusted so that the enemies are equally overpowered in newer games compared to the PCs relative to older games. But I think that there is a psychological distinction between having bigger bonuses versus having smaller bonuses. And having smaller, more modest bonuses kind of keeps in mind, or it drives home to the players that your character isn't super powerful, even though realistically there's not actually any difference, because in reality the math, like I said, is the same. So I think one of the things that's a good thing to do is to have a look at ability score generation, make sure it's not a little over the top. Maybe look at some of the older methods of how ability scores were generated and what bonuses they gave, and see if you want to make some adjustments. If you actually make your PCs a little bit underpowered relative to the monsters by changing those, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because in D&D, as it's been designed since 3rd edition, the players are clearly designed to win by just showing up and picking fights. It's actually kind of famous in newer editions of D&D that it's rather difficult for characters to die, player characters. It's okay if they're a little bit more fragile relative to the threats. They can still handle them, but they may have to think a little harder and be a little bit more careful. That's not a bad thing. So that's the first thing. Second thing, ability scores. Next thing I think was races. Most of the core races in D&D, even 5th edition, aren't too egregious here, although in many cases some of the traditional, conventional races have gradually been replaced by more exotic races. But it's really kind of more in the additional supplements where you get the really bizarre things like, turtle people and raven people and elephant people and, hippo people and I don't know what other ridiculous things that they have, brass clockwork people and all kinds of other weird things. These don't really jive very well with a tone that's more grimdark. For one thing, they kind of make the game feel like a little kid's cartoon show from the 80s for 6-year-olds. For another thing, it's too colorful and exotic and whimsical to have all these strange races. Now, I am not necessarily against having more races. Gary Gygax famously never seemed to understand why anybody would want to play anything other than a human swordsman, because he thought those were the coolest thing. I'm not quite that dogmatic, and I do understand why players may want to play other races. I think new players in particular want to kind of indulge in some kind of power fantasies, and they want to be beautiful or cool or whatever. And as they kind of do that for a while, many of them will start to come to appreciate more of the grimdark aesthetic, if you will, where characters are not necessarily meant to be cool, they're meant to be interesting. And humans are actually more interesting than most races in the game. Quite honestly, I don't think most of the races are super interesting, especially the animal people, where you just act like, I presume, an animal, or it's just the equivalent of a rubber mask and they act just like people, they just don't look like them. I actually kind of prefer to have races that reinforce the mood and the tone. So for example, in the Dark Fantasy X game, which is supposed to be a darker horror themed type of game, there are other races, but they're all kind of cursed or tainted by some supernatural bloodline or supernatural event that kind of turn them almost into monsters, but not quite. They're still mostly human. They just kind of have a hint of something else. Like the Wood Roses have a hint of werewolves from their ancient ancestors who were werewolves, and the curse is kind of faded, but they're still kind of hairy and animalistic, and they live outside and they get angry fast and lose control, etc., etc. Or, the Tieflings, which are a race that's become quite common in D&D since 4th edition, because they were very popular in Planescape, I think in particular from 2nd edition. They have a touch of demonic or other fiendish ancestry. They're kind of, natural edgy characters by virtue of that in its own right. So you can certainly have more races, but I think you need to be a little bit more thoughtful about what races you allow and why. And if you've got your cat people and your, pigeon people or whatever the heck D&D has these days, that's not going to feel grimdark. So that needs to be a change. As a GM, you kind of need to talk to your characters and say, look, we're going for a particular mood and tone, therefore some of these options just aren't going to fit. I think you also need to talk about classes. Most of the classes in D&D are meant to emulate superheroes, quite frankly. They have all kinds of weird superpowers that you pull out and say, I'm going to do this move from my character sheet, and it's a super move. I kind of feel like you're playing Street Fighter or even more maybe the Marvel versus Street Fighter, where you've got your Marvel characters thrown in there too, and you do your special joystick and button combinations and you get a super move. And I feel like that's in many ways what Dungeons and Dragons and related games have come to resemble more than they did, in my opinion, more than they should. Especially this is true if you want to have more of a grimdark-like theme. So, but way back even in the early days of 3rd edition, I was looking for alternative classes that I could use so that I could still have options, but I could kind of remove an awful lot of the magic. So the Ranger, for example, why does the Ranger have spellcasting and other magical abilities? And that's a rhetorical question, but it's easy to come up with alternative Ranger classes, and in fact many were done even before 3rd edition became 3.5, and I kind of collected alternative Rangers because I really like the archetype, but I never really liked the class. I think that some other pruning needs to be done as well. Besides just that, it's really hard to make paladins fit in any way in a grimdark setting unless they're constantly struggling against every facet of the setting, for example. And I know paladins have changed. They're not necessarily lawful good anymore. It really doesn't make any sense to me because they now no longer fit the definition of a paladin. But you kind of get my point. Certain character concepts and certain character archetypes embodied by the classes just don't really work. And they kind of you need to come up with some changes. And there are enough alternatives out there for most games that you can do that, but you might have to do some judicious editing of what's available. Next thing, hit points. Most characters in D&D have a lot of hit points relative to what they used to have. And older games were kind of famous as being meat grinders in a lot of ways, where your first level character could literally, if you weren't very lucky, could have a single hit point, and his chance of surviving to second level was very, very low. And if he did, it was really cool, and then you got to go up and you were still in the single digit hit points. But, you didn't have one anymore. I actually think it's okay. It's possible to go too far with this. Many people are familiar with Call of Cthulhu, which is, of course, supposed to be a dark game. It's supposed to be a horror-themed game. In my experience, it's often not, especially if it's a one-shot or a convention game or something like that, because everybody kind of goes into it with the expectations that characters are going to flame out left and right over the course of the session. They're either going to die or go insane, and it isn't horrible or even dark anymore. It kind of becomes kind of amusing, and it's watching them flame out is kind of an esoteric in-joke after a while. And I've never found that actually works very well for generating the mood and tone of a more grim, darkish game. So I think that it's definitely possible to go too far with making your characters too underpowered and too fragile. But, there's still the spectrum between Call of Cthulhu first level characters or whatever and 10th level D&D characters is really big. So I think what I prefer is to give characters more hit points than your typical old D&D or OSR game would have, but have a much flatter progression as they get up to maybe 10th level, which would be the absolute top ceiling that I would ever consider playing. They gain hit points at a much slower rate. In my game, they only gain on 2 per level. So they don't get new hit dice, they just get a couple new hit points as they go up in level. And frankly, although I say 10th level is the highest level I would go. In reality, I probably would rarely, if ever, go above 5th or 6th level. And so I think that's a big part of it. You want your characters to be a little bit survivable so that they can actually live through the horror of the game, the grim darkness, and experience it, and not just, you're rolling up several new characters per party every session, because that's no longer dark. That's just becomes, a bit of a laugh after a while. You want them to be anti-fragile enough that although there's always a risk of them dying, in reality, most characters survive for a big chunk of the campaign, if not even possibly all of it. But there's always a risk of them dying because they are much more fragile than D&D characters, and the players know it, and so they're much more careful with them. So again, I start with more hit points than OSR games, but even OSR games or old D&D games had your character gain hit points at a radically fast pace as they went up in level. So you need to kind of curb that, and along with that, you may also very seriously consider going with a very slow level progression. Most games since 3rd edition that I've been in, if you play by the book and if you play modules, and when I've played rather than run, I've almost always been in pre-written modules, I've found that player characters will get a new level on average every 2nd or 3rd session. So if you play a campaign that lasts for 6 months, you're quite high level by the end of it. If you want to maintain more of a grimdark tone, you don't want them to get to quite high level. You want them to still be relatively low level, even after months of play. And the only way to do that, really, of course, is to drastically reduce the pace of leveling. And there's various ways to do that, because there's various ways of leveling. I mean, if you're giving out XP, just, give out 25% of what the book says, or even 10%, so that you can just have a much slower progression, so that you can play each level for several sessions, many sessions, in fact, before you move up to the next level. Not only will they appreciate their levels more when they gain them, but you never lose that sense of, you're fragile and you know it. There's a lot of other rules that are not necessarily character generation, but are kind of related to some of this, and they're often discussed, in the same section as character generations. Like if you talk about hit points, they talk about what happens if you lose hit points. Most games, again, since 3rd edition, have been relatively generous to kind of keep characters from dying too easily. As I recall, and it's been a while since I played it, the D20 games, the 3rd edition and the other related similar games, most of them you would die at negative 10 hit points. And if you were in negatives but not all the way at negative 10, you would very slowly lose 1 hit point per round. You could get stabilized by either, I can't remember if there was a stabilization check you could make on your own, or if somebody else had to try and stabilize you. But you very rarely saw a character die unless you really took some incredibly massive damage when he was already low, or if the player just decided to let him die. This has become even more true, I think, in 5th edition. Although the mechanics are different, I think it's still incredibly difficult to die. And they've given these death saves that now you have to fail 3 of them to actually die, and the DC is only 10. It's a little ridiculous. And I don't necessarily have a problem with the concept of death saves, because again, I don't think characters should die too often, and I think that that's actually counterproductive to the mood of a darker horror game if they're just dying all the time, because then it just becomes a rather silly meat grinder where nobody cares anything at all about any of the characters. So whatever mood or tone there is completely lost. So you want your characters to be survivable, but you want them to always feel like if they're not careful or if they're unlucky, they could easily go out, and any combat they get in could punch their ticket, although realistically most of them will not. I know that's kind of a tricky line to try and straddle, but I think that's where you need to be. So I don't have a problem with the concept of death saves. I think that 3 of them is a bit much. In my game, I only allow 2, and once you fail the second one, you're just dead. I also think that the DC of 10 is ridiculously easy. It's so low that there's almost no point in even rolling it. I think it needs to be at least 15. And I do it, my death saves are a con bonus plus level check with a DC of 15. And again, if I'm only playing up to about 5th level and my con bonuses are, between 0 and 5, let's just say, and my level is only between 1 and 5, when you're kind of at the top end of that, you get a pretty decent bonus, and hitting 15 isn't too hard. But when you're at the lower end of that, either because you have a low con or because you're only 1st or 2nd level, your bonus to that check is going to be less than 5, and the average on the roll is going to be about 10. So you're going to fail it more often than not at 1st level, especially with a character who has average or lower constitution. So it's pretty dangerous for lower level characters. The higher level you get, it becomes less dangerous. But again, this is part of the problem with levels. Levels fundamentally change the tone and the genre of the game. And you got to be very careful with levels. I'm not against levels. I actually do kind of like the concept of levels, but I'm not a fan of fast leveling, and I'm not a fan of really generous leveling where they give you just giant handfuls of new abilities and bonuses every time you level. I think they should be more modest, more subtle, and they should certainly be much more slow. The next thing I want to talk about is magic. Usually this is kind of how it comes in most rule books. Although it's kind of part of character generation, it's usually a chapter a little bit further out. Magic in Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons-like games is pretty routine, and lots of characters can access it. In fact, most character classes have at least some access to magic. Much of the magic is convenient. It's simple. It's really simple. There's a couple of very minor changes you can make to make magic a little more dangerous and edgy again. And you don't want to go too far with that again, because you want characters who really want to play a character who can use magic. You want to give them the option, but you also want to bring home the fact that magic is not quite the same. And Dungeons & Dragons has made magic the opposite of magical, and so have most of the games that are spin-offs of D&D, quite frankly, like Pathfinder or Tales of the Valiant, or I don't know, any of the retro clones, for example, or the other games that are kind of similar. Now, there are some games that actually do manage to do this, however, at least to some degree, and they are newer games that are somewhat modern in their design, but they also deliberately try to be old school. This is, ironically, however, not an aspect of old school gaming that magic was dangerous, but games like Five Torches Deep, or Shadowdark, or Deathbringer, or Knave kind of make magic more dangerous. And the basic way to do this, the most simplest way, is you get rid of spell slots and spells per day. People who can cast magic, characters who can cast magic, learn their spells. They can cast them as much as they want. But, like everything else in D&D, you have to roll to be successful. And so you make a roll to cast your spells. Low-level spells probably have a relatively low DC, but you get into slightly higher level spells. You could have really quite high DCs that they need to roll extremely high to be successful on. In my opinion, I don't think you want failures to be catastrophic unless they are critical failures, by which I mean a natural 1 on this roll. However, a natural 1 comes up on average once every 20 times you roll a d20. And for characters who are casting spells as their main class feature, it's not hard to imagine them casting 20 spells per session. And on average, they'll have one natural one. What happens on a critical failure? This is where things get really interesting. What I've done in my kind of house rules, my template, if you will, that grimdarks up the game, is that if you roll a natural one, you are going to have a spell backfire. What mostly happens is you become the target of your own spell. So if you cast Fireball, which is an area effect spell, or Sleep, which is also an area effect spell, you become the center of that area. This is particularly dangerous because now it means your entire party, depending on where you're all standing, presumably you're kind of in a little group, becomes the target. If you are trying to cast Sleep on some bad guys or monsters that you're trying to sneak past, and it backfires and you and your whole group falls asleep instead, you're probably dead. If it's Fireball and you set your whole group on fire and do tons of damage to them, again, that's terrible news. If it's not the type of spell that does actual damage and can't backfire that way, then what happens instead is that some kind of otherworldly creature is torn out of the outer darkness where magic comes from and manifests right in front of you and obsessively attacks the spellcaster until one of the two of them is dead. This doesn't have to be a super dangerous foe. It can be a low-level demon like an imp or something, or it can be something a little more meaty like a Hound of Tindalos, which is what my original incarnation was. But it needs to be otherworldly. It needs to be something that, especially if you're in the middle of combat or if you're by yourself just kind of doing your magical research, it could potentially be extremely dangerous. You want magic to feel like, yeah, sure, I can cast a spell, but I have to kind of think about, do I want to right now? Is it worth it? Because if you fail, it's bad news. Or if you critically fail, I should say. I've also added to my game, and this maybe is a little bit much, a sanity mechanic. And if you fail, not even a critical fail, but any failure of a spell, you have to make a sanity check. And it's basically just a saving throw of your level plus charisma. And I think the DC is 10 plus 2 times the spell level. So like a second level spell, the DC would be 14. And you make this check, and if you fail it, you consult a little table. It's a little D6, and you roll a D6 table, and you have to then suffer the effects of that insanity. And most of them are minor. It's very rules light and simplified compared to something like Call of Cthulhu has, where I think their sanity mechanics are a little cumbersome, quite frankly. It's a great idea, but a cumbersome implementation. I have something that's much more rules light and quick. If you critically fail, the other thing that happens with sanity is that you are at risk now of having a permanent penalty to all additional sanity checks that you take from that point on, because it's actually permanently damaged your psyche. So, again, these critical failures make magic pretty edgy. Even if you're casting a relatively simple spell, you probably are going to want to stop and think about, is it worth the risk? And you're going to find that wise magic users, wizards, sorcerers, witches, I actually kind of tend to lean into the darker titles, because there's no good-natured, friendly wizards in a grim, darkish setting. They're all kind of power-hungry madmen to some degree. And this is why, because if they have any wisdom at all, well, first off, they'll probably avoid it. But if they have not quite enough wisdom to avoid magic, but they still are relatively wise, what they will probably do is cast very few spells, quite honestly, and unless it's a pretty serious situation and it really calls for it. And that doesn't happen every day. So I think that's something that needs to be done. Those are what I've done with my magic rules. there's other alternatives, and like I said, many of the games that I referenced earlier, Five Torches Deep, Deathbringer, Knave, and Shadowdark, for instance, have at least to some degree some of those. I actually got the idea, not that it's super unique, but I got it way early in 3rd edition, long before any of this stuff came out, by just reading old Warhammer 40K rule books where the Psychers would, potentially have their heads explode, or some chaos demon would appear out of the, out of the chaos dimension and attack them. And that's where I really started the idea of, magic is crazy. And then, of course, I got the D20 Call of Cthulhu book and thought it was really quite fascinating. When D20 Modern came out and the Urban Arcana campaign setting that went along with it, they had the idea of incantations, and they had also the Shadowstalkers campaign model, which was much darker. It was kind of deliberately based on Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, which was kind of popular still at the time. And, again, all of these were games where the point of Magic was that it was a little bit mysterious, it was a little bit dangerous. Every time you decided to cast a spell, it was a little bit of a tense moment because you had to roll the dice, and if it came up bad, it wasn't just, I guess I'll try again next turn. There was just the risk that something much worse than that happened. And I think that this is crucial to having that tone of grimdark. But again, you don't want to go too far, because you don't want to make it so ridiculously punitive to try and cast a spell that nobody ever tries to cast a spell. And you probably have at least some players that actually want to play, or did I say players? You probably have some players that want to play characters who want to seek after magic and use it. And so again, there's a line, and if you go beyond it, then you've gone too far and you've actually made the game less fun. But if you go right up to it, you've changed the mood and the tone in a deliberate way that can still be just as fun as the more high fantasy D&D way of playing. But it will be very different. And I think that that's what you want to do to Magic, to grimdark up your game. Finally, let's talk about monsters. I said earlier that in D&D, magic is the opposite of magical. For the most part, in D&D, monsters are also the opposite of monstrous. Let's look at a couple of examples, and one of this is from 5th edition D&D, The Lost Mine of Phandelver, which is from one of the 3 starter boxes, and it's considered kind of the classic 5th edition starting module, I think. There's also Burnt Offerings, the first module of the first adventure path by Paizo, when they kind of lost the rights to Dungeon and Dragon magazine and kind of decided to go on their own. And what they did, this is before they even created the Pathfinder game, so it's still 3.5e compatible, although it was later updated and became kind of the iconic first adventure of Pathfinder. And both the situation and the place that it was set kind of became the iconic Pathfinder set. Both of these modules start with basically the same thing, where your first real encounter, your first real combat encounter, is with a little group of goblins. And goblins, of course, are supposed to be monsters, but in both cases, these encounters are not meant to be very serious. They're meant to be easy. In the basic box, part of the reason for that is because the assumption is you may well be running this for brand new players, and they kind of need, a quick and easy combat that they can kind of flex their characters' abilities, learn how they work, learn how combat works, without actually being very threatened. So the goblins, in all of these cases, are a little whimsical, a little bit silly. They're not really meant to be a threat, and they're not. They're easily defeated. They kind of pop out and make some relatively ineffective attacks against the PCs, and then kind of stand there to be easily dispatched as soon as the PCs get a turn. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what you want to do with monsters. Monsters should never be routine. Player characters should never leave the house in the morning, give their wife a kiss and say, "Bye, honey, I'm off to the adventure." And then on their commute, they run into monsters that are just routine and boring and not a threat. Monsters should always be a threat. They should always be scary. And they should always be almost the center point of an adventure, maybe a small adventure, but they should almost be a whole scenario in and of itself to face a monster. They should be foreshadowed, and they should be dangerous. And yes, even the lowly goblin and kobold and other, weak monsters can be dangerous if they are played right by the GM. So if you foreshadow them, if they're cunning and use good tactics, or come out in mobs and, really kind of make the PCs have to be on their toes in order to defeat them, that's what you want, because they're monsters. What monsters should really be, even beyond that, is that they should often be beyond the capabilities of the PCs to defeat in a straight-up fight. So that the PCs, if they want to actually defeat a monster, they either need to do some research to find out what its weaknesses are, or to set some kind of cunning plan or trap to negate its advantages and to give them instead some kind of advantage. Or maybe they can't even be defeated, and at best they can be kind of incapacitated and stopped, banished back to hell or wherever they came from. But they can't be straight up killed and you don't really want to either, because the notion is frightening, and the likelihood of PCs dying if you just go jump in a straight up fight with monsters should be relatively high compared to what it is in D&D, at least. So again, I'm not suggesting that you should routinely kill PCs by throwing monsters at them that they can't defeat. What I am suggesting is that you change the whole aspect of how monsters are presented. They're not ever routine. They're not ever something that you just kind of run into as random encounters or just on your commute on your way to the adventure or whatever. They should be foreshadowed. They should be dangerous. They should be such that the PCs are always a little bit uncertain that they can defeat them, and so that they are encouraged and gradually learn, if this is a hard thing for them to figure out, they gradually learn that they have to put a little bit of work into beating monsters. They can't just kind of show up and shout huzzah and charge into battle and expect to win, because that's not monstrous. So what if, though, you want to have plenty of combat, but you want to be careful with how you handle monsters? What if, in fact, you even want to have an easy combat like these goblins in the Last Mines of Phandelver, or the goblins who attack Sandpoint in Burnt Offerings? They're not meant to be difficult, but, you want to have a combat where the PCs can kind of learn the rules, learn the ropes, or just kind of get used to their characters and what they can do, and it's meant to be easy. Well, simple. You have them fight humans. And in fact, if you want it to be easy, make sure they're really kind of pathetic humans. They're basically beggars or destitute bandits out in the woods who are attacking you. Sure, they want to kill you and take your stuff, but they're kind of doing it because they're kind of pathetic and they're almost even sympathetic. What you will find is that this changes the mood and the tone tremendously for two reasons. For one thing, most players, not the characters, but the players, will find it a little bit ickier to just kill people as opposed to kill goblins, even if the people are trying to kill them and even if they're clearly bad guys. This is even more so if the people have at least a little bit of sympathetic vibe to them. They're dressed in rags, they look like they're starving, they're clearly destitute and desperate. That doesn't mean that they're not, very malicious in their intent towards you and your characters, or toward your characters, but there's a little bit of a moral grayness to it too. This kind of gives a very different tone and much more of a grimdark kind of feel to them. In fact, you would be surprised, you can actually make really quite interesting games where most of your combat encounters are just bad guys or even wild animals. Now, most people don't really think about this because most people don't spend a lot of time in the wilderness. I'm here to tell you from firsthand experience, you go hiking by yourself or even in a small group in grizzly bear country, it feels different than going hiking and camping anywhere else. And you go doing that in Africa where you've got lions, where you've got hyenas, where you've got elephants even though they're herbivores and are kind of seen as sympathetic, charismatic creatures, they can be extremely dangerous to people who have to defend themselves against them with just a few sharp pieces of metal. And you'd be surprised that you can make really interesting campaigns where the monsters are the showpieces, but the rest of the combats, 4 out of 5 combats, are just with bandits, with spies, with gangsters, with cultists, or with wild animals that are, for whatever reason, looking to hunt you, looking to kill you, chase you off because they're very territorial. I'm telling you, wild animals, even the ones today, can be very dangerous, especially if you're not prepared to deal with them. And I think a lot of gamers don't realize that because a lot of gamers aren't, in fact, most people in our society in general are not very outdoorsy people. I think 100, 150, 200 years ago, everybody would have understood the danger that a pack of wolves in the woods, threatens to a small group of travelers. Much more so a pride of lions, a tiger, a crocodile, again, an elephant, a grizzly bear, even a moose or a stampeding herd of buffalo. All of those could be extremely dangerous and could offer kind of interesting combat challenges without having to dip into everything you fight has to be some kind of strange exotic monster. In fact, that's one of the things that I don't like much about D&D, about the module design in particular, is that they feel so bizarre because they're constantly trying to wow you with some mechanical gimmick. Oh, you're going to fight this weird monster that we made up just for this that is based around some kind of gimmick. And I don't think personally, I don't think that that's very interesting. I know a lot of people who are probably more into the tactical aspect of the game probably are more interested than I am. But I don't think it's very interesting. And I certainly don't think that it does anything at all to further a grimdark mood or tone. In fact, I think it kind of does the opposite because if your players are getting hung up more on the tactics of working around some strange ability that it has or some bizarre, esoteric, exotic, nature of the creature, that actually is counter. It's maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but that's not very horrific. It's not very scary. It's not very dark. It kind of is a different challenge that has a totally different mood and a totally different tone. Just like the old meat grinder dungeons full of ridiculous traps is not horrific either. It just becomes, you kind of laugh about, my progression of halfling characters, Bingo and Dingo and Ringo and Singo, who all got killed by, whatever traps in the Tomb of Horrors. That's not a horrifying anecdote. That's kind of a funny one. That's a joke. So I think, again, monsters, you want to always foreshadow them. You want to make them always be dangerous. You want players to always feel like, if it's actually a monster, I don't know for sure that we can beat it. And we might want to take stock and figure out what we can do before we go face it to even the odds, to kind of give ourselves an advantage because we already know in advance that we need it. And then, again, you have them face wild animals and people. And again, when they're more mundane like that, even if, maybe they're not as exotic from a tactical and mechanics standpoint, it does an awful lot to further the mood because fighting people is different than fighting monsters. And no matter, even if, it's just a game and you're not really thinking about it, Everybody in the back of their mind thinks, I'm killing these people is very different than I'm killing some faceless weird monster that serves no purpose other than to be killed. And as a person, even if it also serves no purpose other than to be killed, it is an artifact of the game, of course. But at the same time, you know it's a person, and it kind of, I don't know, there's just a little bit of a difference there. So anyway, these are my tips on how to make a game more grimdark. And maybe grimdark's, again, too much of it's not quite that far. It's not truly grimdark, but it's darker. It's on the spectrum getting close to grimdark. If you do all these things, or even do some of those things, you can decide how much further on that spectrum you want to ratchet your game away from, the 5th edition or whatever game you're playing, Pathfinder, whatever it may be, away from that standard into a more darker, grittier one. And I personally think there's no reason to look for a grimdark exclusive game. I think D&D works really well for fantasy, but in order to make it hit certain moods and a darker, kind of more dark fantasy mood, does require a little bit of work, and it does require a few house rules to kind of change the way certain things feel. But it's not as many house rules as you think, and it's quite easy to implement them. It's like just a little template that you kind of throw on top of your game, and suddenly your game is very, very different, and it feels very, very different. It's easy to do. I recommend it. I really enjoy it. If you don't, then, the standard game is, of course, always there for you. But sometimes you kind of want to play a game that starts off feeling like D&D, but after a while you realize you're actually playing fantasy Call of Cthulhu. I love it. Anyway, good luck. Talk to you later.